The first sound isn't a voice, it's metal. Leg shackles scraping across a courtroom floor in New York City. Then Nicolás Maduro appears not behind a podium, not wrapped in flags, but in prison colors, escorted by US marshals, stepping into a federal courtroom for the first time. "I was kidnapped," he says calmly. "I am a president and a prisoner of war." That sentence isn't a defense. It's a declaration. Because this moment is not just about guilt or innocence. It's about who gets to define power, who gets to write the story, and whether a courtroom can overrule a presidency. I'm Kaitlan Collins. And if you think this is just another dramatic arraignment, don't look away. Because what unfolds here reshapes how leaders fall, how justice travels, and how narratives become weapons. Stay with me. Because to understand what this moment really means, we have to go deeper. This case looks simple on the surface. A defendant enters a courtroom, charges are read, a plea is entered. But nothing about this moment is ordinary. Nicolás Maduro isn't just any defendant. He identifies himself first, not by name, but by title, President of Venezuela. And he doesn't describe his arrest as law enforcement. He calls it capture. That distinction matters. Because inside this courtroom, two realities are colliding. One is the US legal system. Procedural, restrained, methodical. The other is a head of state insisting this is not justice, but warfare by another name. The judge asks him to confirm his identity so proceedings can begin. Maduro complies. Calm, precis. Then he tries to tell his story and is immediately stopped. "There will be a time and a place," the judge says. That exchange sets the tone. This isn't just about drugs, weapons, or indictments. It's about whether political power can redefine criminal accountability, or whether the courtroom refuses to bend. And to understand how this standoff became possible, we need to rewind. What happened in that courtroom didn't begin in New York, and it didn't begin this week. It began with how power hardens over time. For years, Nicolás Maduro ruled not just through institutions, but through control of territory, of military loyalty, of narrative. Inside Venezuela, authority flowed downward. Orders weren't questioned. Accountability rarely traveled upward. But outside Venezuela, a parallel system was forming. A system where borders matter less than charges. Where sovereignty collides with jurisdiction. Where political leaders are no longer untouchable simply because they hold office. That shift didn't happen overnight. It followed a familiar cycle. Consolidation of power, international isolation, escalation, then rupture. By the time US forces arrived at Maduro's compound, the legal groundwork had already been laid. Charges existed. Allegations were formalized. The machinery was waiting. What made this moment explosive wasn't just the arrest. It was where it led. From Caracas straight into a US federal courtroom, from president to defendant. And once that line was crossed, there was no quiet way back. Because the moment a leader enters that room, everything accelerates. The first rupture comes fast. Not with a verdict, not with a sentence, but with the operation itself. Overnight, US forces move in. Maduro is arrested at his compound in Venezuela. At the same time, missile strikes hit military bases. This is no quiet extradition. It's force, precision, shock. By the time he appears in court, the message has already been sent, not just to him, but to anyone watching. This wasn't about waiting. It wasn't about negotiation. It was about control of momentum. Inside the courtroom, that tension follows him. Maduro stays calm, expressionless. He takes meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad, even asking the judge to confirm he can keep it. This is a man trying to hold on to order while everything familiar collapses. Then a voice cuts through the room. Someone from the public gallery shouts that Maduro will pay for his crimes. Maduro snaps back instantly. "I'm a president and a prisoner of war." That's the moment the crisis becomes visible. Because now, this is no longer just about charges. It's about identity under siege and a man reframing his fall as resistance. And if you're still following this story, pause here. Because what looks like defiance is also strategy, and the system he's pushing against is colder than he realizes. What Maduro is doing in that courtroom is not spontaneous. It's calculated. Calling himself a prisoner of war isn't rhetoric for the room. It's a reframing of the entire system around him. Because if this is war, then the courtroom is no longer neutral ground. The judge becomes an agent, the charges become weapons. And the verdict, whatever it is, becomes illegitimate by definition. That's the mechanism at work. Maduro isn't trying to win the case in that moment. He's trying to move it out of the legal realm entirely and into the political and moral one. Notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't argue the details of the charges. He doesn't challenge evidence. He doesn't seek bail. Instead, he asserts identity, title, status. President, captive, victim, and the system responds the only way it knows how. By refusing to engage, there will be a time and a place. That sentence is power, too. Not loud, not emotional, procedural. This is how institutions defend themselves, not with speeches, but with structure. And when structure meets narrative warfare, something has to break. What breaks next isn't the courtroom, it's the human cost surrounding it. This is where the story stops being abstract and starts becoming personal. Because while cameras stay locked on Maduro, the damage spreads outward quietly, unevenly, human by human. In that same courtroom sits a Venezuelan reporter. She isn't there as an observer of power, she's there as collateral. She tells us that US missile strikes during Maduro's arrest damaged her family's home near Fuerte Tiuna in Caracas. Her childhood space, her memories, shaken not by words, but by force. And then there's you. Because when leaders fall this way, it's never just them who pay the price. It's families, neighbors, people who never stood at a podium or signed an order. Maduro's wife sits beside him. Quiet, bandages near her eyes and forehead. Lawyers asking for medical scans, bruised ribs, possible fractures. No slogans here, no speeches, just bodies absorbing the impact of systems colliding. If you've ever wondered who really carries the weight of political power, this is your answer. Not the one speaking the loudest, but the one standing closest when it breaks, and once that damage begins, it never stays contained. What happens in that courtroom doesn't stay in that courtroom. Because the moment a sitting leader is arrested by a foreign power, tried in a foreign court, and labeled a criminal, every border starts to feel thinner. This case sends a signal far beyond Venezuela, to allies, to adversaries, to governments watching closely, asking the same quiet question: could this happen to us? If a president can be seized at home and flown into a US courtroom, then power is no longer anchored solely in territory. It's anchored in reach, jurisdiction stretches, precedent forms. For some nations, this looks like accountability finally catching up. For others, it looks like a warning shot law, backed by military force, and that's how global tension spreads. Not through declarations, but through examples. Because every leader now has to calculate not just domestic approval, but international vulnerability. Not just legitimacy at home, but exposure abroad. This is how geopolitics shifts quietly, structurally, case by case. And once the world absorbs that shift, the future stops being theoretical. It starts demanding choices. From here, the story splits, not into headlines, but into possibilities. There are 3 paths forward, and none of them are clean. The first is the controlled outcome. The courtroom holds. The process moves slowly, deliberately. Maduro remains in custody. The case grinds forward, and the message becomes narrow. This was about these charges, this defendant, this moment. The system absorbs the shock and moves on. The second path is murkier. Legal proceedings continue, but the narrative overtakes them. Maduro's claim of being a prisoner of war gains traction beyond the courtroom. Supporters amplify it, critics dismiss it. The trial becomes a symbol instead of a process, and legitimacy fractures depending on where you stand. Then there's the third path, the dangerous one, where this case becomes precedent, where power responds to power, where arrests lead to retaliation, and law becomes inseparable from force. In that future, courtrooms don't de-escalate conflict. They formalize it. None of these outcomes are guaranteed, but all of them are now possible. And that's the real turning point. Because once a system shows what it can do, everyone has to decide how they'll respond. What you saw in that courtroom wasn't just a man answering charges. It was a system testing its own limits. A president in shackles, a judge unmoved, a sentence, prisoner of war, thrown like a flare into the global sky. This case forces an uncomfortable question, not just about Nicolás Maduro, but about power itself, because when law crosses borders with force behind it, the world changes. Quietly, permanently. Some will call this justice. Some will call it overreach. Most people will simply feel the consequences long after the cameras leave. And that's why this moment matters. Not because of how it ends, but because of what it makes possible next. I'm Kaitlan Collins. And if you want to understand how power is being redefined, how courtrooms are becoming frontlines, and how today's precedent shapes tomorrow's world, stay here. Share this, and watch what happens next. Because this story isn't over, it's just entered its most dangerous phase.